Have you ever heard of the Highway of Tears, a stretch of road in British Columbia, Canada, infamous for the disappearance of Indigenous people, predominantly women? This isn't a tale of a haunting legend or a chilling urban myth. Instead, it's a distressing reality that has been unfolding for decades, barely a blip on the radar of national consciousness. Picture this: a desolate stretch of road slicing through the wilderness, the once vibrant lives of Indigenous girls and women reduced to road markers and silent whispers. This is the Highway of Tears, a grim testament to the systemic negligence and apathy that allows such atrocities to persist. The Highway of Tears isn't just a place, it's a lingering question that demands our attention. It forces us to question why so little is being done to solve the disturbingly high number of disappearances and murders of Indigenous peoples across Canada. Why are these voices being silenced? Why are these lives, these stories being relegated to the margins of our awareness? It's an unsettling reality that the cries for justice from these communities are often met with silence or, at best, half-hearted commitments. Despite the alarming frequency of these cases, they are often treated as isolated incidents rather than a pattern of systemic failure. This isn't an issue that can be swept under the rug or ignored. It's a glaring injustice that deserves our full attention and action. The lack of urgency and action from the authorities is not just disheartening, it's a betrayal of the very principles of justice and equality we hold dear. When lives are lost and people disappear without a trace, it's not just a tragedy for the victims and their families, but a failure of our society as a whole. In the next few minutes, we will journey through the chilling chronology of these disappearances, starting from the first known case. We will delve into the unsettling question: why is so little being done to address this ongoing crisis? And most importantly, we will explore what can be done to place more pressure on police and politicians to ensure these missing persons are not forgotten and that suspects do not go unpunished. The first known case dates back to 1969, a year that marked the beginning of a horrific pattern. In the heart of British Columbia, a young Indigenous woman named Gloria Moody vanished without a trace. She was last seen leaving a local bar, her cheerful laughter echoing into the night. Gloria was a loving mother, a cherished sister, and an integral part of her community. Her disappearance sent shockwaves through her tight-knit community, a community that would soon be marred by a chilling pattern of disappearances. Gloria's case was not met with the urgency it deserved. The initial police response was lackluster at best, with crucial time and evidence lost in the early stages of the investigation. Her family, desperate for answers, were met with a wall of silence from the authorities. The investigation stalled, and Gloria's case was pushed aside, forgotten by those who had sworn to serve and protect. Despite the pleas of her family, it took weeks for police to launch a full-scale search. By this time, any hope of finding Gloria alive had dwindled. Her family was left heartbroken, their pleas for justice echoing in the wind. In the aftermath of Gloria's disappearance, the community was left reeling. Fear seeped into every corner, every home, every heart. Mothers held their children a little tighter, their eyes darting nervously in the dark. The trust in the local authorities, already fragile, had been shattered. Yet, despite the mounting fear and frustration, the community rallied together. They vowed to keep Gloria's memory alive, to continue fighting for justice, not just for Gloria, but for all Indigenous women who would sadly follow in her tragic footsteps. While the first known case was shocking, it was sadly just the beginning. Gloria Moody's disappearance marked the start of a terrifying trend, a trend that continues to haunt the Highway of Tears. It was a stark reminder of the dangers faced by Indigenous women every day, of the systemic issues that allow these crimes to go unpunished, of the urgent need for change. While the first case was shocking, it was sadly just the beginning. As the years rolled on, the disappearances continued, each one as mysterious and unsettling as the last. A chilling pattern began to emerge from the shadows of British Columbia's dense forests. One by one, Indigenous people, predominantly women, started to vanish along the remote stretch of road now ominously known as the Highway of Tears. Each case was eerily similar to the last, as if the same cruel hand was at work, snuffing out the light of these vibrant lives. The victims were not random, they were part of a community that has long been marginalized, their voices often unheard or ignored. The Indigenous peoples of Canada, who have endured centuries of systemic discrimination, suddenly found themselves in the grip of a terrifying reality. Their daughters, sisters and mothers were disappearing without a trace, their pleas for help echoing in the vast wilderness of the province. The locations of the disappearances, too, were far from random. The Highway of Tears, a stretch of road between Prince George and Prince Rupert, became a haunting symbol of the crisis. This lonely, desolate road, lined with thick woods and often shrouded in an eerie mist, seemed to swallow up the victims, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a lingering sense of dread. Each case seemed to be a chilling echo of the last. A young Indigenous woman, often hitchhiking or walking alone, would vanish. Her belongings would be found scattered along the highway, but she would be gone, as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The families left behind, their hearts heavy with grief, would be left to wonder and wait. Yet, as the pattern became more apparent and the number of victims grew, the response from the authorities was at best lackluster. The cries for help from the Indigenous communities seemed to fall on deaf ears, their pleas for justice met with indifference. Despite the growing number of cases, the response from the authorities remained woefully inadequate. As the number of missing persons increased, so too did the voices demanding justice. There was a swell of voices, a collective cry echoing through the vast expanses of British Columbia, the heartache for the missing reverberating in every syllable. Mothers, fathers, siblings, friends, and even strangers united in their demand for justice. Their pain was palpable, their frustration mounting with each passing day and every new case of a missing person. Protests erupted, not just in British Columbia but across Canada. They marched through the streets, their placards held high, their chants echoing off the buildings. "Justice for the missing!" they shouted. "Remember the forgotten!" Their message was clear. They would not allow their loved ones to become mere statistics in a growing crisis. Campaigns sprang up, each one a desperate plea for action. Social media platforms were flooded with hashtags, each one a name, a face, a story. They were using the power of the digital world to keep the memory of the missing alive, to insist that they were not forgotten. Advocacy groups formed, their mission to bring attention to the crisis, to pressure those in power to do more. They organized vigils, they spoke at town halls, they met with politicians. They were relentless in their pursuit of justice. Their demands were simple yet profound. They wanted action from the authorities. They wanted more resources allocated to the investigations, they wanted more transparency, and they wanted the issue to be treated with the urgency it deserved. They were tired of the inaction, of the dismissive attitudes, and of the endless wait for answers. Yet their cries seemed to fall on deaf ears. They were met with empty promises, with platitudes, with silence. Each unanswered question, each unresolved case was a stark reminder of the apathy they were up against. Yet despite the public outcry, the disappearances continued. The darkness along the Highway of Tears remained, the unanswered questions echoing in the silence, the cries for justice growing louder with each passing day. You may be wondering, how have the authorities responded to this crisis? In the face of the ongoing tragedy on the Highway of Tears, the response of the authorities has been, to say the least, underwhelming. For years, the call for justice has echoed across the vast expanses of British Columbia, yet it often seems to fall on deaf ears within the corridors of power. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, tasked with investigating these disappearances, has been criticized for their handling of the cases. Despite the mounting number of missing and murdered Indigenous women, many families feel their pleas for help are met with indifference. The investigations are often slow and lack the urgency demanded by the circumstances. The lack of adequate resources dedicated to these cases speaks volumes about the lack of priority given to this pressing issue. Political leaders have also been slow to respond to the crisis. Despite public outcry and demands for action, promises of investigations and improved safety measures often remain just that, promises. Statements are made, press conferences are held, yet the tangible action needed to address this crisis is often absent. This lackadaisical approach has only served to fuel the frustration and mistrust among the Indigenous communities. They are left feeling abandoned, their losses seemingly dismissed as less important. This indifference from those in power sends a chilling message that the lives of Indigenous women are not valued. The authorities' response has been riddled with a lack of transparency. Information about the investigations is often withheld from the public and the families of the victims. This lack of openness only adds to the sense of injustice and fuels speculation about the commitment of the authorities to solving these cases. In the end, the response, or lack of it from the authorities, is a reflection of a deeper societal issue. An issue where the lives of Indigenous women are not given the same importance as others. An issue where the call for justice remains unanswered. The response from the authorities, or the lack thereof, has only added to the sense of injustice. Fast forward to today, the Highway of Tears remains a haunting symbol of a crisis that has yet to be resolved. The indigenous community continues to live in fear and uncertainty as the number of unresolved cases continues to climb. It's estimated that over 400 cases of missing and murdered indigenous peoples remain unsolved across Canada, a stark reminder of the dire situation that persists. Despite the grim reality, there's a glimmer of hope. Across the country, voices are rising, demanding justice and accountability. Indigenous communities, social justice advocates, and allies are rallying together, leading campaigns that refuse to let these cases be forgotten. They are shining a light on the systemic issues contributing to this crisis, demanding that the authorities take notice and take action. In recent times, we've seen some small steps forward. There have been increased calls for official inquiries into these cases, and some have even been granted. There's a growing recognition of the need for cultural sensitivity and understanding in law enforcement, and training programs are slowly being implemented. Yet the progress is painfully slow, and the victories feel bittersweet when so many families are still waiting for answers. The haunting echoes of the Highway of Tears serve as a constant reminder of the urgency of this situation. The indigenous community deserves more than incremental changes and empty promises. They deserve justice, they deserve safety, and they deserve to know that their loved ones have not been forgotten. So, what does the future hold for the Highway of Tears? The answer to that question lies in the hands of those in power. It's up to them to recognize the gravity of the situation, to prioritize these cases, and to provide the resources necessary to bring justice to these families. The Highway of Tears continues to serve as a chilling reminder of the action that is desperately needed. It's a call to action that we cannot afford to ignore, because until there is justice, until these cases are resolved, the tears will continue to flow along this haunting highway. So, where do we go from here? What can be done to ensure that these missing persons are not forgotten and that justice is served? Fellow advocates for social justice, it is clear that the time for change is now. While we've shed light on the haunting reality of the Highway of Tears and the largely ignored plight of Indigenous communities across Canada, it's not enough to simply be aware. Awareness must be coupled with action. So, how do we transform our knowledge into action? How do we ensure that the cries for justice on behalf of these forgotten victims echo in the corridors of power? It's a journey that begins with a single step, and that step is engagement. Engagement is the lifeblood of any movement, and the fight for justice for the victims of the Highway of Tears is no different. It's not enough to merely empathize with the victims, we must use our collective voice to demand change. One effective way to do this is by signing petitions. Petitions have the power to show authority figures that there is a strong public demand for action. They are a tangible demonstration of public sentiment, a barometer of the public's will. But our engagement shouldn't stop at signing petitions. We must also be willing to make our voices heard in the streets. We should join protests, attend rallies, and participate in marches. We must not shy away from demanding justice in the public sphere. These actions serve to amplify our voices and ensure that they cannot be ignored. And let us not forget the power of community. We must raise awareness within our own circles, whether it's through social media posts, community meetings, or conversations with friends and family. Every action counts. We must make it clear that the issue of missing Indigenous persons across Canada is not just a problem for the Indigenous communities, it's a problem for all of us. It's a stain on our collective conscience that must be addressed. We must also educate ourselves and others. We should strive to understand the systemic and historical factors that contribute to the continued violence against Indigenous people. In doing so, we can challenge the stereotypes and prejudices that often lead to their marginalization. And finally, let's remember the power of persistence. Change often comes slowly, but that doesn't mean it isn't coming. We must continue to fight, continue to speak out, continue to demand justice. We must not let the issue fade into the background, forgotten once again. In conclusion, the path to justice is a long one, but it is a path we must walk nonetheless. It's a path paved with the courage of those who dare to speak out, the dedication of those who refuse to be silenced, and the hope of those who believe in a better future. We must not remain silent. We must demand action for the sake of the victims and their families and for the sake of justice.